The Jared Dillian Show.
I'm Jared Dillian. This is the Jared Dillian Show. We're going to be talking about the Fed here in a second because you need to know about the Fed. If you want to call to talk about your money, please call 844-305-7800. That's 844-305-7800. This is indeed the Jared Dillian Show. You should know what the Fed is, and you should know what the Fed does. And when I tell you that the chairman of the Federal Reserve is more important than the President of the United States, you have to believe me. And the power of this institution is there's no parallel. There's nothing approaching it. The chairman of the Federal Reserve is a guy named Jay Powell, Jerome Powell. Jay Powell is, he used to be a private equity guy. Worked at a place called the Carlyle Group. He's basically a banker. And he's not an economist. He's not a PhD economist. He's more of a business guy, and he's been doing a reasonably competent job of running the Federal Reserve with a few mistakes here and there. And he's reasonably respected, and I wouldn't say the most respected, but he is more powerful than Donald Trump. He is, which is why Donald Trump beats up on the Fed all the time. You know what's funny? You know what I think about sometimes? Since when has the President of the United States affected your life in any tangible way whatsoever? Like, the only time I can think of that the President of the United States has affected my life in any tangible way was Obamacare and the mandate to buy health insurance. So one day I didn't have to buy health insurance, and the next day I did have to buy health insurance, but I was already buying health insurance, so it didn't affect me anyway. So for me personally, nothing that the president has ever done has ever affected me ever. And we spend a lot of time arguing on the internet about who the next president should be. Guess what? It doesn't really matter. I mean, it kind of matters. I mean, at the extremes, a guy like Bernie Sanders, like, he would probably matter, right? Like, he would change things a lot. But aside from that, most of the candidates out there, things wouldn't really change, I mean, maybe your taxes would go up, maybe your taxes would go down. Since I've been working, since Bill Clinton in 92, he raised taxes to 39.6%. So that was in 92, and ever since then, my taxes have never been in the 20s, and they've never been in the 40s. They've always been in the 30s. So, the small differences here and there are nice. I'll take a small tax cut. But the reality is that, outside of a few small tax changes, whatever a president has done has never really affected anybody. And people go crazy about who should be president, and it does not affect your life. Now, what the Fed does, believe it or not, affects your life. The Fed absolutely affects your life. If the Fed is good at its job, then prices are low and stable. If the Fed is bad at its job, then prices go up and they're unstable. That hasn't happened in a while, but it's happened in history. I mean, actually, it was funny. I saw something on Twitter the other day. Amity Shlaes, who wrote the Coolidge book, and she wrote The Forgotten Man and all that stuff. She posted a picture of a book. I don't know if it was hers, but it was Arthur Burns, chairman of the Fed in 1974, recommending wage and price controls. Okay, that would affect your life. Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve affects your life in just profound ways. For example, the interest you get at the bank, okay? So we used to get, when I was in the 80s, we used to get 8% interest at the bank. Now we get 0% interest at the bank. That affects your life. It affects all the kinds of economic decisions that you make. It affects how much money you borrow. It affects, how you borrow. It affects where you invest. All these decisions because of the price of money that the Fed has set. And by the way, it's a little odd that we entrust setting the price of borrowing money to people. It's the interest rate, the price of borrowing money is the most important price in the economy. And in the rest of the economy, we let the market decide. But when it comes to money, when it comes to interest rates, we have a guy decide, which is madness. But, I can't remember the exact year of the Federal Reserve Act. I want to say it was 1913 or 1914. It was when Woodrow Wilson was president. And, in the whole history of our country, there's been, various incarnations of basically a national bank. But the Federal Reserve Act was entirely different. And, we're going to talk about what the Fed does in a second, because it's not just set monetary policy. That's one of the things it does. Believe it or not, the Fed clears checks. Like if you write a check to somebody and they deposit it like that, the Fed clears the checks. That's a big job. It's also a regulator. The Fed regulates banks. It has very strong regulations. That's an important job. And it decides on monetary policy. So what is monetary policy? Monetary policy is how big the money supply is, how much money in the economy, and what are interest rates. And if you want to stimulate the economy, then you put more money in the money supply and you lower interest rates. Now, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of this right now, but one of the things that the Fed is doing in repo operations is this is already too complicated, but the Fed is injecting money into the economy right now, sort of in short-term interest rates. So that's different discussion. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is government spending. So monetary policy is setting interest rates. Fiscal policy is government spending. What is the government doing right now? They're spending lots of money. We have lots of debt. Trump has a very expansionary fiscal policy. So we have a very expansionary fiscal policy and we have a very expansionary monetary policy, which means the economy is on fire and the stock market goes up forever. So this is, it's not rocket science. It's not rocket science. And like I said, the Fed chair is more important than the president by a factor of 10. The president picks the Fed chair. The Fed chair is not an elected official. He is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Now, if you go back to when Trump was picking Powell, Trump, not super smart on this type of stuff. He had a number of candidates. Powell was one. Powell was probably the least qualified. He had a guy named Kevin Warsh, who used to be on the Board of Governors, and he had a guy named John Taylor, who was a Stanford economist. And he passed up those guys and picked Powell because he thought that he could control Powell. Now, guess what? He was right, Trump says he can remove the chairman of the Fed, but legally he cannot. It's a 4-year term. And if Trump is still president after November 2020, my guess is we'll have a different Fed chairman in a couple of years. The Federal Reserve System has 12 banks in it, 12 regional banks. There's a board of governors with a chair and a vice chair, 7 people, and there's 12 regional Fed presidents, which are not appointed by anyone in the government. They're just appointed by the boards of directors of the bank. And these people make a committee. It's called the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, and all these people set monetary policy. These are the people who have the capacity to make a giant mistake and make everything a lot more expensive. I'm Jared Dillian. This is The Jared Dillian Show.
Jared Dillian. Now you know a rich guy.